The light of Elgar and Ivy's 3 moons shimmered over the dense marshlands, casting eerie shadows across the water. Zera's gills flared as she navigated through the towering reeds, her webbed feet slipping silently through the shallows. Her heart was still pounding from the shocking sight in the skies, a ship tearing down through the atmosphere, ablaze like a vengeful comet. She'd only ever heard of ships like this in tale stories woven with dread, passed down from one generation to the next. The tales always began the same way. Long ago, strange visitors had come from the stars in vast, metallic vessels, disrupting the natural rhythms of Elgar and 4. They were called humans, and the stories described them as ravenous creatures who could devour flesh to survive, their teeth sharp as a predator's and their hunger insatiable. Her ancestors spoke of how these carnivorous beings feasted on animals they killed with weapons of fire and metal, a notion that horrified the peaceful, plant-feeding Elgorians. The elders warned her that if one ever returned, they'd come only to bring hunger and violence. Yet here she was, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, following the path of destruction left by the crash. As she approached the site, her breath caught at the sight of the wreckage. A metal carcass sprawled across the marsh, smoking and torn open like some wounded beast. Pieces of it lay scattered, some embedded in trees, others sinking into the murky waters. Then, through the haze and shifting shadows, she saw him a human. He was lying motionless on the muddy ground, his body still and battered, face smeared with streaks of blood and grime. Zera froze, her heart racing as every warning she'd ever heard crashed over her. He was exactly as her people had described, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in strange, bulky clothing. She imagined his sharp teeth hidden behind those cracked lips, just waiting for the chance to bite. Her instinct screamed at her to flee. She should have turned and run back to the village, to tell them that the nightmare had come true. A human was here, lying wounded yet terrifying in their midst. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Against her better judgment, Zera edged closer, watching for any sign of movement. He didn't stir, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Dark red blood pooled beneath his arm, seeping from a gash across his bicep. She recognized the severity of the wound. Without immediate care, he wouldn't last long. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. She didn't want him here, yet the idea of watching him die felt wrong. Conflicted, she stood over him, every moment weighing on her mind. She thought of the polgar leaves growing in clusters nearby, the natural salve known for its healing properties. She also thought of her family, her village, and the anger they would feel if they discovered she'd aided this creature of legend, this carnivorous being. But Zera was a healer by nature, a caregiver, someone who found comfort in easing pain. Her hand hesitated, hovering over his arm. She could treat his wounds and leave him to recover alone, out of sight of her village. He didn't need to know she had helped him. In one swift movement, she pulled a few polgar leaves from her satchel, crushed them, and began applying the cool paste to his wound. She worked quickly, casting nervous glances around, half expecting her own people to emerge from the shadows and drag her back to the village. As she worked, the human stirred. She froze as his eyes fluttered open, and for an instant, their gazes met. His eyes were a color she had never seen, a piercing blue that reminded her of the sapphire rivers of her homeworld. She felt a jolt of panic as he opened his mouth to speak. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, barely a whisper, but there was no malice in it, only confusion. Zera's heart hammered against her chest. His voice was softer than she'd imagined, less like the growl of a predator and more like a human being. His eyes, though clouded with pain, held no trace of hunger or violence. I am Zera," she said, her voice barely audible. You crashed on my planet." He took in her words slowly, as if struggling to comprehend them. "I crashed?" His gaze moved to the wreckage behind him, then back to her. He took a deep breath, wincing as he tried to sit up, only to collapse back with a grimace. "Yes," Zera replied, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "You're injured." Helping you. He chuckled softly, the sound weak but surprisingly light. Not the kind of greeting I expected from an alien, he murmured, his tone faintly amused. Zera frowned. Alien? You. You are the alien here. His lips curled into a small smile. Guess we're both aliens to each other. Silence settled between them, broken only by the quiet hum of insects and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. She steadied his face, noting the lines of pain etched across his brow and the tension in his jaw. He seemed vulnerable, not like the fearsome beast she'd been warned about all her life. It was confusing. This was not how she'd expected her first encounter with a human to be. Your name, she found herself asking, what is it? He swallowed, his gaze softening. Ethan, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to come here. My ship. Something went wrong. His voice trailed off as he glanced at the twisted wreckage around them. I didn't expect to survive the crash. His honesty disarmed her. She had anticipated hostility, even aggression, but not this quiet vulnerability. Zera felt a spark of empathy flicker in her heart, despite herself. Rest, Ethan, she murmured, her hand lingering near his shoulder, as if to reassure him. I will help you. But you must stay hidden. My people. They fear your kind. They would not understand. He nodded slowly, as if sensing the gravity in her tone. Thank you. Zera. His words were soft, and for the first time, she thought she heard a genuine warmth in his voice. Stepping back, Zera watched as he closed his eyes and drifted back into unconsciousness. She hadn't intended to get involved. She'd wanted nothing more than to leave him and let the stories fade back into legend. But now, looking at him lying there, injured and alone, she knew she couldn't abandon him. As she returned to her village, Zera's mind whirled. She had acted on impulse, and she would have to hide her decision from her family, from her friends, and from the elders. But as she thought about Ethan's face, his voice, his words, a small seed of doubt took root in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, the stories had been wrong. The dawn brought a veil of fog over the marsh, cloaking Elgar and Ivy's lush, alien landscape in a muted haze. Zera moved quickly through the reeds, her body tense, heart racing. She had barely slept after the night before, haunted by thoughts of Ethan, the wounded human she had chosen to help. Every step toward him felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been taught, yet something deeper compelled her forward. When she reached the crash site, Ethan was stirring, his face etched with discomfort as he tried to move his injured arm. She approached cautiously, torn between the urge to help and the persistent dread of what he might do if he discovered her weakness. His kind were known to turn on others when they sensed vulnerability. At least, that was what she had always believed. He must have heard her approach, for he looked up with a weak smile, his face pale and drawn. Good morning, Zera, he murmured, his voice rough but strangely warm. She noticed that his eyes, though weary, were alert, taking in the marshland around them with evident curiosity. She forced herself to return his gaze, watching him as if waiting for some shifty flicker of hostility, perhaps a glimpse of that legendary hunger her people feared. But all she saw was pain and gratitude. You're still here, he said softly. There was a hint of surprise in his voice, as if he hadn't expected her to return. Zera nodded stiffly, keeping a safe distance. I brought more salve for your wound, she said, avoiding his eyes. She held out a pouch filled with the crushed leaves she had prepared the night before. Ethan extended his uninjured hand slowly, accepting the pouch with a nod. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. I don't know how to repay you for this. She watched as he began to apply the salve, her gaze flickering between his fingers and his face. Human hands were strange thick, broad, and lacking the delicate webbing her people had. But they were precise as they moved over his injury, his expression pained but determined. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of marsh insects and the soft splash of water. Zera's curiosity finally overcame her caution. Why did you come here? She asked, the question leaving her lips before she could second-guess herself. Our planet has been closed to outsiders for generations. No one comes here unless they're invited. He looked up at her, his gaze thoughtful. I wasn't supposed to be here, he replied, pausing as if to choose his words carefully. I was on a mission scientific exploration. We've been studying nearby star systems, but something went wrong with the ship's navigation. I lost control. Zero watched him, trying to make sense of his words. So, you're not here to harm us? Ethan's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Harm you? No, Zara, I'd never want to hurt anyone here. I only wanted to explore to understand the galaxy better. He hesitated, his face growing solemn. But I've heard stories too. About worlds closed off to us, about alien species that fear us. Some for good reason, I suppose. Zara's heart tightened. The acknowledgement felt strangely intimate, like he understood the walls she had built up around herself. It was the first time she realized he, too, might know what it felt like to be misunderstood. Our people. She hesitated, feeling the weight of her own fear and suspicion. Our people believe that humans are carnivores. That you prey on other beings to survive. We've been taught to fear you, to believe that if you ever came here, it would be to conquer us. Ethan looked taken aback, but then he nodded slowly, seeming to consider her words carefully. It's not completely untrue, he admitted. Humans are omnivores, we do consume both plants and animals. But most of us would never prey on another intelligent being. We're not perfect, but we're not monsters. The way he spoke, with such calm honesty, unsettled her. She had expected defensiveness, maybe even anger, but there was only a quiet sadness she realized, with a hint of embarrassment, that she had come prepared for battle not with weapons, but with every shield of suspicion her people had ever given her. Your people, do they believe all humans are monsters? He asked, his gaze searching. Zara hesitated. Yes. The stories of what happened when humans first came here. They've haunted us. We were terrified. We thought you would come back to finish what they started. Ethan leaned back, his face troubled. I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I'd had a choice, I wouldn't have come here at all. He let out a low sigh, as though carrying the weight of his entire species' mistakes. But I'm here now, and I can't change that. They sat in silence, each absorbing the gravity of the other's words. Zara's mind churned, her emotions tangled between the tales she had been raised on and the person sitting in front of her, wounded and alone. She wanted to hate him, to hold on to the fears that had been her protection, but every glance at his face seemed to erode that certainty. Then, out of the quiet, he spoke again. You've been kind to me, Zara, he said softly, his voice laced with gratitude. Despite what you believe, despite the fear. Why? She didn't have an answer, not one that made sense, anyway. I don't know, she admitted. I just couldn't leave you there to die. I'm a healer. It felt wrong. A faint smile crossed his lips. A healer. He paused, as though tasting the word. I don't deserve your kindness, maybe. But I'm grateful. Zara swallowed, fighting the emotions stirring within her. She knew she was treading dangerous ground. If her people discovered she was helping a human, she would be exiled or worse. But something about him felt different from the stories, and that difference gnawed at her, challenging her deeply ingrained beliefs. Rest, she said, her tone softer than she intended. You need to recover if you're going to survive in these marshes. Ethan nodded, lying back against a mossy rock, his eyes fluttering shut. She stayed close, watching him, torn between curiosity and caution. The longer she watched him, the more she questioned the validity of those ancient tales. Could it be possible they had all been wrong? Her musings were interrupted by a distant, shrill cry scream that sent a chill down her spine. She jumped, recognizing it as a cry for help. Her heart pounded as she scanned the direction of the sound, her mind racing. "That's someone from my village," she whispered, mostly to herself, already moving in the direction of the sound. Ethan's eyes opened, his expression alert. "What's happening?" he asked, attempting to rise despite his injuries. "Stay here," she said sharply. "You're hurt, and it's dangerous." But Ethan, ignoring her warning, pushed himself up. "I may be hurt, but I'm not useless," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Lead the way." Zara hesitated, unsure of whether to trust him, but there was no time to argue. Together, they moved swiftly through the marsh, the distant cries growing louder as they approached. When they arrived, Zara's heart dropped at the sight. Her younger sister, Arya, was entangled in the deadly web of a glimmer spidery creature that rarely ventured this far out but, when it did, was lethal. Zara froze in horror. The spider's iridescent threads were tightening around Arya, and she could see the poison seeping into her sister's skin, leaving dark streaks where it touched. Arya's face was pale with terror, her eyes wide and unfocused as she struggled in vain. Zara's mind went blank with panic. She had no weapon, no way to fight off the glimmer spider without risking her own life. But Ethan didn't hesitate. Moving with surprising agility, he approached Arya, reaching into a pouch on his belt to pull out a small blade. Zara's heart leapt in alarm. She feared for a moment that he might harm her sister, that his true nature might finally reveal itself. But instead, Ethan began to cut through the web, his movements careful, precise. He glanced at Zara. "Help me hold her still," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We have to be fast, or the poison will spread." Still in shock, Zara moved beside him, pressing her hands against Arya's shoulders to steady her as Ethan worked. She could feel her sister's pulse, frantic beneath her skin, her breaths ragged and shallow. Within moments, Ethan had freed her from the web's grasp. Arya collapsed against Zara, weak but alive. Ethan wasted no time. He retrieved more polgar leaves from Zara's pouch and pressed them against Arya's wounds, his movements filled with the same gentle care he had shown for his own injuries. Zara felt a wave of gratitude, mingled with a new sense of awe. The human she had feared, the creature she had been taught to despise, had just saved her sister's life without a second thought. As they lifted Arya to her feet, Zara's gaze met Ethan's. In that moment, her heart shifted. She realized that he was not a monster, he was something else entirely. Zara and Ethan helped Arya back to the village under the dim light of Elgar Ivy's moons. Zara's heart pounded as they neared the entrance, a modest pathway carved out of the towering marsh reeds, winding through the bioluminescent pools that shimmered like stars on the ground. Every step reminded her of the risk she was taking. If the villagers saw Ethan with them, if they discovered he was the human of legend, there would be no understanding, no chance for him to explain. Her people's fear was deeply rooted, and one moment of panic could ruin everything. Arya, though weakened, clung to Zara as she stumbled along, her breath shallow. Zara could feel her sister's relief mixed with confusion. She kept glancing back at Ethan, her expression shifting between gratitude and suspicion. He had saved her, yet he was still a human being who, in her mind, embodied the fears and warnings of their people. As they approached the edge of the village, Zara halted, her grip tightening on Arya's arm. "Ethan," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "You can't come any closer. If they see you." Ethan nodded, understanding. His face was a blend of exhaustion and relief, his hand still pressed against his side where he had been injured. "I understand. I'll wait here." Zara hesitated, feeling an odd ache at the thought of leaving him there alone, on the outskirts of a world that viewed him as nothing but a threat. But she nodded, trying to focus on the safety of her sister. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. She wanted to say more, to tell him how his actions had challenged everything she'd believed. But in that moment, words felt inadequate. He gave her a faint smile, a flicker of warmth in his tired eyes. Go. Take care of your sister. With that, Zara led Arya back into the village, her heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. They had barely reached the edge of the village square when others noticed them, rushing forward with exclamations of relief and curiosity. Zara! Arya! What happened? Cried Eli, one of the elders, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of Arya's pale face and the marks left by the glimmer spider's venom. Zara held her breath, trying to think quickly. We were by the edge of the marsh when a glimmer spider attacked Arya, she said, keeping her voice steady. I managed to free her, but she was entangled for some time. She needs rest. The villagers murmured, their eyes wide with fear and awe. Glimmer spiders were a rare but known threat, and anyone who survived an encounter was considered incredibly fortunate. She's lucky to be alive, murmured Eli, his gaze shifting between Zara and Arya. You both are. Zara simply nodded, feeling the weight of her lie pressing down on her. She couldn't explain how she had freed her sister without mentioning Ethan, but she couldn't betray his presence either. She only hoped her people would accept her vague account without question. But Arya, still weak but lucid enough to speak, looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. The human, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Zara tensed, her heart skipping a beat. She met her sister's gaze, silently pleading with her to stay quiet. Arya fell silent, her eyes widening as she seemed to grasp the implications of Zara's urgency. She leaned into her sister, letting Zara guide her toward their dwelling without another word. Once inside the privacy of their home, Zara helped Arya lie down on a soft bed of woven reeds, draping a blanket over her sister's weakened form. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them both. Zara could feel the questions in Arya's gaze, questions she had no easy answers for. Finally, Arya spoke, her voice barely a whisper. You helped him. The human. Zara met her sister's gaze, a wave of conflicting emotions rising within her. She wanted to defend her actions, to explain the truth about Ethan and how he was different from the legends, but the words felt tangled. How could she express the gratitude she felt for his courage and kindness, emotions she herself barely understood? Yes, she replied softly, choosing honesty over evasion. He saved you, Arya. If it weren't for him, I couldn't have freed you from the web in time. Arya's eyes widened, her expression a mixture of shock and awe. But why would he do that? The stories they say that humans are dangerous, that they have no compassion. Zara sighed, running a hand through her hair as she tried to find the words. I thought the same thing, she admitted. But Ethan. He isn't like the stories. He was injured when he crashed here, vulnerable. I could have left him, but I didn't, and instead of attacking, he thanked me. He saved you without hesitation, Arya. He's not a monster. He's like us, in many ways. Arya's gaze softened, a glimmer of understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. But before she could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. Both sisters froze, fear flashing between them. Zara quickly rose, opening the door a crack to find Eli and two other village elders standing outside, their faces etched with concern. Zara, Eli began, his voice grave. May we come in? She nodded, stepping aside to allow them inside. They entered, their gazes shifting between her and Arya, taking in the lingering signs of fear and exhaustion on both sisters' faces. Eli's expression was thoughtful, and she could tell he had questions that wouldn't be easily deflected. We have heard troubling rumors, Zara, he said, his tone measured. Arya mentioned a human. She was delirious, perhaps confused, but this cannot be ignored. You know what such a presence could mean for our people. Zara's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Arya, who looked down, her cheeks flushed. She wanted to defend Ethan, to tell the elders of his kindness, but she knew they wouldn't listen, not yet. Arya was disoriented, she said carefully. The glimmer spider's poison. It causes hallucinations. She must have imagined things. Eli studied her intently, his eyes sharp. Perhaps, he murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. But understand this, Zara. If a human were truly here, they would be seen as a threat. The council would have no choice but to drive them away or worse. We cannot risk the safety of our people. The unspoken warning hung heavy in the air, and Zara felt a chill run down her spine. She forced herself to meet his gaze, masking her emotions behind a calm facade. I understand, Elder. Eli nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave, the other elders following him in silence. When the door closed behind them, Zara let out a shaky breath, her body tense with the weight of her secret. Once they were alone, Arya sat up, her expression troubled. Zara, if they find him. They'll kill him. I know, Zara replied, her voice barely a whisper. Which is why I have to protect him, no matter the cost. Arya looked at her sister, a new understanding reflected in her gaze. He really did save me, didn't he? She asked softly, as if only now fully accepting it. Zara nodded. Yes. He saved you. He didn't ask for anything in return. He's not like the stories, Arya. I think we've been wrong about humans, or at least about him. For a moment, they sat in silence, the gravity of Zara's words settling over them both. Finally, Arya reached out, placing a hand on her sister's arm. Then we protect him, she said firmly. If he saved my life, then I owe him mine. Zara's heart swelled with gratitude, and she nodded, relief flooding through her. With Arya by her side, she felt emboldened, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As dawn broke over the marshes, Zara prepared to venture back to where she had left Ethan. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a budding trust that seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. She knew that keeping him hidden would be difficult, that the risks were high, but she was determined to protect him. When she reached the edge of the marsh, she found Ethan waiting, his face drawn with exhaustion but brightening at the sight of her. Zara couldn't help but smile, feeling a strange connection blooming between them, fragile yet resilient. I see you survived the village's questions, he said with a wry smile, though his eyes held a hint of worry. Yes, she replied, her tone soft. And I'll continue to protect you. Arya knows now, and she wants to help. She knows what you did for her. Ethan's expression softened, and he nodded. Thank you, Zara. I didn't expect this. Neither had she. But as she stood there, gazing at him, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. Together, they would rewrite the story between their worlds, a tale not of fear and mistrust, but of bravery, compassion, and unity. And for the first time, she felt that perhaps the bond she was forging with him might change both their worlds forever. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act for Zara, filled with tension and secrecy. She and Arya worked together to bring Ethan food, water, and healing herbs, keeping him hidden in the marshlands just beyond the village. They spoke in hushed tones, meeting under the cover of night to check on his recovery, all the while knowing that the elders and villagers remained on high alert, ever watchful for any sign of an intruder. Ethan, for his part, was unfailingly grateful, and as his strength returned, he became increasingly curious about their world. Zara found herself telling him stories about Elgarin Forest's crystalline caves that glowed with bioluminescent minerals, the vast sapphire lakes that mirrored the sky, and the serene traditions of her people. She shared tales of the ancient bond between the Elgorians and their planet, a relationship rooted in harmony and respect for the natural balance. He listened intently, often looking at her with a mix of wonder and admiration that she hadn't expected. And, in turn, he told her about Earth, a world of sprawling cities, towering mountains, and technology beyond her imagination. She learned about his home, the constellations he had seen, and the thrill of exploring unknown planets, driven not by conquest, but by a desire to understand. The more they shared, the more Zara's fear and suspicion faded, replaced by a growing respect and connection. Ethan became more than the carnivorous human of legend. He was a person with dreams, fears, and a heart as capable of kindness as her own. And soon, Zara began to wonder if their ancestors' stories had been wrong all along. Yet the village remained tense. The elders sensed something stirring, though they couldn't pinpoint what, and rumors of an unknown presence continued to ripple through the community. It was only a matter of time before someone grew suspicious enough to follow Zara. The inevitable happened one evening when she and Arya brought Ethan a warm meal and a few fresh clothes. As they sat talking, a shadow shifted in the distance, and before they could react, Eli and two other elders emerged from the reeds, their faces dark with anger and fear. Zara's heart sank as she scrambled to her feet, shielding Ethan with her body. The elders stopped a few paces away, their eyes fixed on him with looks of shock and horror. "A human," Eli spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You've brought a human into our midst, Zara. Have you any idea what you have done?" Zara swallowed, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Please, Eli, listen to me. He's not here to harm us. He crashed by accident, and he's done nothing but show us kindness. He even saved Arya's life from a glimmer spider." The elders exchanged glances, their expressions incredulous. Eli's gaze hardened. "You expect us to believe that a carnivorous creature helped save your sister? Do you realize how many stories we have told to protect our people from their kind?" Zara nodded, her voice rising with emotion. "Yes, I know. I grew up hearing those stories too. But I have seen with my own eyes that Ethan is not a monster. He is no different from us, in his heart." Ethan, who had been silent, stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I don't want to cause any harm," he said softly, his voice carrying a calm sincerity. "I know your people have every reason to be cautious, to fear what they don't understand. But I am here by accident. I only want to return home, and I would never hurt anyone here." Eli's expression wavered, the hardness in his eyes momentarily softening. He studied Ethan, as though searching for the monstrous features that had been described in every story, but finding instead only a wounded man with a genuine desire for peace. "Your words mean little to us, human," said Elder Rena, one of the others. "Our people have been safe because we have kept your kind out. Why should we risk our lives, our peace, by allowing you to stay even one moment longer?" Zara stepped forward, her voice filled with conviction. "Because he saved us. He saved Arya when he had nothing to gain. And he showed me that everything we thought we knew about humans may not be true. If we drive him away, we're turning our backs on an opportunity for understanding, for peace." The elders murmured amongst themselves, uncertain. Zara could see their inner conflict, the battle between fear and reason playing out across their faces. Finally, Eli sighed, a weight of years and caution etched in his features. "Very well, Zara. We will allow him to speak before the village. But know this, if he cannot convince us of his good intentions, we will not hesitate to protect our people." Zara nodded, her heart pounding. It was more than she had hoped for, a chance to bridge the divide that had haunted her people for generations. Ethan glanced at her, his face pale but resolute, and she offered him a reassuring smile. The next evening, the villagers gathered in the central square under the twin glow of Elgar and Ivy's moons, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, fear, and skepticism. Ethan stood before them, his posture open and respectful, every word he spoke carefully chosen, as though each one held the power to shape his fate. He spoke of his people's desire to understand the universe, their longing for connection beyond their own world. He described his journey as an explorer, not a conqueror, and how his crash had brought him not to an alien land, but to the kindness of Zara and her people. His voice was humble, filled with gratitude and respect. Zera watched as her people listened, their expressions shifting as he spoke. Some eyes softened, some remained hardened, but she could sense the seeds of doubt being planted, the legends they held dear being challenged. When he finished, silence settled over the square, thick with tension. Then, unexpectedly, Arya stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the crowd. "It was Ethan who saved me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He freed me from the Glimmer Spider's web when no one else could. He didn't have to help me, but he did. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here today. How can we call him an enemy when he risked his life to save mine?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Zera could see the villagers exchanging glances, their fear beginning to fracture, replaced by something else, curiosity, the stirrings of hope. Finally, Eli stepped forward, his face solemn. He looked between Ethan, Zera, and Arya, his expression unreadable. "You ask us to abandon centuries of caution and accept you, human, as something other than the monster we were taught to fear. It is no small request. But—" He paused, his gaze softening. "Perhaps it is time to reconsider what we believe." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "This human has shown us compassion, kindness, and bravery. If we continue to live in fear, we are no better than the darkness we claim to guard against. It is time we look beyond our stories, beyond the legends, and see what is right before us." The villagers shifted, nodding slowly, faces marked by hesitation but also a flicker of something new, a willingness to trust. With a nod to Ethan, Eli extended his hand. Ethan looked down at it, surprised, then grasped it firmly, a look of relief flooding his face. The two stood there, a human and an Elgorian, united in a gesture that was small yet monumental. In the days that followed, the village welcomed Ethan as a guest rather than a threat. He shared more stories of Earth, taught them about human customs, and learned about Elgorian traditions in return. The fear that had once separated their worlds began to dissipate, replaced by understanding and respect. Zera felt a sense of joy and fulfillment that she had never known. She and Ethan spent hours talking beneath the stars, sharing dreams and visions of a future where their peoples could coexist, exploring each other's worlds without fear. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to the power of empathy and courage in the face of fear. As the time came for Ethan to repair his ship and prepare for his journey back to Earth, the villagers gathered to bid him farewell, their faces marked with respect and gratitude. He had become more than just a visitor, he was a friend, a symbol of change and possibility. Before he left, he turned to Zera, his eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you, Zera," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You took a chance on me when no one else would. You changed everything." Zera smiled, her heart full. "Thank you, Ethan. For showing us who you really are, for giving us the courage to see beyond our fears. You'll always have a home here." With a final nod, Ethan entered his ship, casting one last look at the village that had once viewed him as a monster and was now sending him off as a friend. As he soared into the stars, Zera felt a sense of hope that extended far beyond the marshlands of Elgorian 4. She knew that they had forged a new path, one that would resonate across generations, a story not of fear, but of unity. And as the night enveloped the village, she watched the stars with a heart that was forever changed, knowing that somewhere out there, a friend was doing the same.